and welcome to Creative Edge Writers Showcase. I'm your host, Christie Stratos, author of Anatomy of a Darkened Heart and Lock and Key, and owner of my own editing company at proofpositivepro.com. This show is part of the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and our guest tonight is multi-genre author with more than 60 books published, Ed Willett. Thank you so much for being here, Ed.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start out with you telling us a little bit about yourself and what you write.
Well, I write both fiction and nonfiction. On the nonfiction side, I write anything that, which has tended to be a lot of science topics and history and other things for educational publishers. And locally, I've done quite a bit of local history for various organizations like the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Saskatchewan. I just like saying that. Saskatchewan Mining Association and things like that. So they're kind of histories of sort of technical organizations going into my interest in science. But on the fiction side, I'm pretty strictly science fiction and fantasy.
That's great. And you actually have two new releases. Actually, we have a few things to talk about with your releases. People have plenty of great works of yours to get started on. If they are looking for a science fiction, fantasy author, nonfiction, really anything, they can come straight to you. So let's start with your newest one, Paths to the Stars, which I believe released on July 3rd. And that is an anthology that includes science fiction, fantasy, and horror. It was, it sounded like it's a little bit of everything, which is fantastic. And so my question for you was, I was wondering if it was written, like these stories, were they written for this anthology, or have you gathered like a collection of short stories over the years that you wanted to put into a book, and this was the perfect opportunity?
Yes, the latter. This is really it's not done in chronological order, but in many ways it covers my career. I think the oldest story I wrote when I was 19, and it came second in the creative writing contest at my university, Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas. And the most recent one was published in an anthology called Planetary Venus just this year. So, and everything in between. The bulk of them were previously published, but there are some that are seeing print for the first time. And in one case, one that was kind of never published as a short story, but became my novel, Marseguro, which won the Aurora Award for Best Canadian Science Fiction Novel from Daw Books, and another one that was published as a short story and became my first novel that Daw published, called Lost in Translation. So for people who have read some of my novels, they might find that particularly interesting as well. And there's some stories that, I don't know, maybe they never should have been published, but it was my book and I liked them, so I put them in.
That is great. It's probably a great introduction to you, and it's a really great piece for anybody who already likes your writing.
I would hope so. And the other cool thing about it from my point of view is that although I've done a little independent publishing before, I've now launched my own press, Shadowpaw Press, named after our cat, Shadowpaw, and his little picture is the logo. And that's very exciting for me as well, because it's just interesting to see things from that side. And I do have a little bit of bookstore distribution happening in a minor way, and I hope to increase that. And in fact, my next book, although I'm editing it, is not something I wrote. It's going to be some First World War memoirs from my grandfather-in-law, I guess, who's a very interesting guy. So with this, I feel like I can bring out all sorts of things, and perhaps at some point I'll do an original anthology and put out a call for submissions, and who knows. So that's why I decided to set up as a press as opposed to just strictly self-publishing. So this launches that, so that's very exciting for me as well.
I noticed that, and I went to check it out immediately, and I was actually going to ask you that, so I'm glad you told me. That's fantastic. I guess that people could keep their eyes on Shadowpaw Press, because in the future, who knows what you'll be asking for, if you'll be asking for something, so that's probably something to watch for all of our authors out there.
We just have to see if I can actually sell any books. That'll be the next thing.
Good test, yes. I did see also, though, for your book, Paths to the Stars, that each story has an introduction written by you, and that those introductions have insights into your career. And so, first of all, I think that that is a really great thing for anybody, again, anybody being introduced to you, or even people who already love what you write. But I thought immediately, introductions into your career. I really hope this is not your last book or even close to it.
No, and no, I mean, I don't write that much short fiction, so it would be quite a while before I'd have enough to do this again. I think of previously published short fiction. I could perhaps see myself doing a book of short stories at some point, original short stories. But with all the novels I have to write, that also seems somewhat unlikely. No, this was just something I've wanted to do it for a long time. In fact, I started pulling stories together into a manuscript years ago. But and the reason was that when I grew up, what got me into reading science fiction fantasy was more short stories than novels. And one reason this has introductions is because a lot of those short story collections back then, that's how they were done. I think of Isaac Asimov's mini collections, and there would always be a little thing at the front talking about where they came from and stuff like that. So in a way, this book is the kind of book that I read growing up that got me hooked on science fiction and fantasy. And I still have a few of those anthologies kicking around on those bookshelves you see behind me. If you're watching this on video. If you're not seeing much of anything. And so this is kind of a throwback in a way for me to the way that I got interested in the field in the first place.
Yeah, and since it's short stories, and you're saying that some short stories that you wrote ended up turning into novels, would you say, do you think, I mean, do you prefer any form? I know you also write poetry. Is there any form between poetry, short story, novels that you prefer or find easier or anything like that?
I definitely think in novel terms, and that's why these stories turned into novels. And yeah, short stories, I do them, but these days I tend to do them if I'm asked to do them for an anthology. 3 of these were just published in the last, it was like one a year for the last 3 years. I've had a story in an anthology. But in each case, I was kind of asked to write something. So it's not something I turn to normally. Normally, I'm focused on novels, and the poetry is a rare thing. Although I do indeed have a poetry book out that just came out this year as well.
Yeah, and I know that you just recently published, I believe, I Tumble Through the Diamond Dust. So could we hear more about that? That sounds really interesting.
It was. It has a very interesting backstory, as my anime watching daughter likes to refer to that. About 2 years ago, the poet laureate of Saskatchewan, Gerald Hill, very accomplished poet, put out a challenge for Poetry Month, which was April, in that he sent out 2 lines from published Saskatchewan poetry every weekday to all members of the Saskatchewan Writers Guild. And there's about 700 members, I think, something like that. And the challenge was to create new work, either incorporating those 2 lines or responding to them in some way. And much to my surprise, since I don't, as I said, particularly self-identify as a poet, I wrote a new poem every day. And being who I am, they were all science fiction or fantasy. And then you sent them to him. And he actually picked 6 of mine for a collection of some of the work from that challenge called First Lines. It was published by a local press. He edited them as a poet would edit them. And I looked at those edits and I thought, that's fine, but I wrote them as a science fiction writer would write them. And some of what he took out was stuff that I thought, from a science fiction point of view, should be in there. So I always knew I kind of wanted to bring it out myself, and I finally did that this year. And I also knew I wanted it to be illustrated. And I'd cast around for illustrators. I'd approach big names in the field like Bob Eggleton, and he would have done it, but for more money than I thought it was likely to bring back in sales. And then I realized I was being an idiot because my niece, Wendy Nordell, who lives in northern Alberta, is a very talented artist. And I asked her if she would illustrate it, which she did gloriously, with black and white illustrations for each poem. So I have 22 poems, and they all tell little science fiction or fantasy stories. And that was published by your Nicholsworth Publishing here in Regina, which is a hybrid publisher, in that they do a lot of distribution and they do editing. They do really great layout. And then you also pay for some of that up front. So, but she also got a couple of good grants from the government for the book. And in the end, it came out without us losing any money. So that's good in a poetry book.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Poetry is not something that I relate to science fiction. So that really sounds very different. Did you struggle at all trying to make that work? Or did it just really come to you naturally once you started?
No, I didn't really struggle at all. It was a very interesting process getting those 2 very different lines, which had nothing to do with science fiction or fantasy. And then I would get that little twist in my head of how to make it into that. And they came out fairly easily. I wrote one a day for that entire month while doing everything else. So I was probably spending, maybe for the longer poems, I might have spent 2 or 3 hours on them. The shorter poems, less than that. Um, but it's not just me that writes this. There is a whole science fiction uh, poetry association. sfpa.org, I think, is their website. And they have a magazine, and they give an annual award called the Riesling Award. Riesling Award, I guess. Riesling is the wine. Sees where my mind is. So I'm not alone in this. It is the thing. And many of the science fiction fantasy magazines actually will occasionally publish poetry.
That's really amazing. It's not something that I personally knew as someone who reads science fiction here and there. So that's really, really interesting to me. Now I want to go look at that. Since you mentioned the Saskatchewan Writers Guild, I know that you write for their magazine. You have a column. Their magazine is called Freelance. Your column is called Space Time Continuum.
Yes.
And you once wrote an article called "What's the Big Idea?" And the idea behind the article was that a lot of people ask you, where do you get your ideas, and what is your process? And so one of the processes you mentioned, maybe this is what you use most of the time, is that you get an initial image in your mind, and you then ask yourself questions about that image. And that's how you that's how you got your first outline, at least in the situation you were talking about. It might have been Cityborn, which we're actually going to talk about anyway. But then you said that you get your big idea, like what is the point of the whole thing, the big idea behind it, later sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And you compared the process, and I really like this quote, to an oyster crafting a pearl around a piece of grit. So I thought that was a really great comparison. And I wondered, based on that, it sounds like, first of all, it sounds like a very reasonable process. But I also wondered if you think that it's sort of easy for you to just come up with this vision, if that's like your typical thing, you come up with this vision and then ask yourself questions. Is this something you would recommend to other people, or is it just sort of how it always just tends to work for you?
It is very much my process, and it is something when I'm teaching writing or talking, and I've been a writer in residence at the Regina Public Library, and I worked with like 70 wannabe writers during that year. And I've done a lot of with high schools and all sorts of places. I do some writing instruction or talking. And that's always what I come back to. For me, it's the process. And I think it's the process everyone uses, although you have to ask writers individually, which actually segues nicely into something else I wanted to mention that's coming up, which is I'm going to be starting my own podcast called The World Shapers. And that's going to be what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk to science fiction fantasy writers to see if we all follow similar processes or how other people might do things. It's going to be very much focused on the writing process. And I'm really looking forward to getting that started and talking to other writers. And because to me, it seems like that's the way it has to work. But maybe there's another process that I'm unaware of, or people think of it in different ways than I do. I'd forgotten that bit about the grit and the oyster. That is good. I'll have to write that. Oh, I guess I did write it down.
Yes, it was great. Yeah, I really liked it. I did wonder, does it create any editing problems if you don't have your big idea figured out, which, I mean, I don't always have my big idea figured out either as an author, but I wondered, does it create any issues in the process? You write your book and you said you had no problem writing at all without the big idea. You had, the outline, and that was the most important. And then you have the big idea later. And then when you go back and edit, is that like a difficult process for you trying to apply that big idea to everything, or is it actually really easy for you? How do you find it?
I think the big idea is already there. It's just hidden in the plot and other ideas that got the story going. So it's usually just a matter of looking at the text and thinking how I can enhance that throughout so that it comes out if it needs to. Sometimes I discover it and I look back and I say, well, yeah, it's there. And it's not that much in the rewriting. And of course, for the DAW books, I'm working with Sheila E. Gilbert, Hugo Award-winning editor there, who's been in this business for like 30 years and edited an amazing number of books and very well-known books and top authors in the field and all that. So when she goes through it and makes suggestions as to how it could be improved, which she does, and sometimes that relates to that as well, and then I also have another set of eyes telling me maybe you need to beef this up here or things like that. Mm-hmm. But I think because I find these, and sometimes I have the idea right up front. The Cityborn was unusual in that I was going along And it was working. The plot was there, and then all of a sudden I realized that there was this sort of overarching theme, and that was clear to me. And I don't know that I ever articulated anywhere, but hopefully by going back and making sure it was present throughout, it comes across to anyone who's reading it. It was a little different because I actually kind of stalled on it a little bit because I just didn't quite have a handle on it. And then it came back to life when I did find that big idea. And there's something else I just wrote recently that was somewhat similar in that I got 2/3 of the way through it and stalled for a long time. I was writing it on spec, so there was no deadline to it. And then suddenly I thought, oh, now I get it. And then I carried on. So sometimes we just have to let our subconscious nibble away at these things for a bit.
Definitely. I can 100% agree with that. The City Born, by the way, has a paperback coming out in August, right?
Yes, it came out in hardcover last August, and it's a little unusual that it's been a whole year before the paperback comes out, but it will be out August 7th, I think, is the official release date. It's been out in ebook as well all that time, but the mass market paperback, I hope, will find it a few more readers.
Definitely. Let's go back to your podcast, World Shapers. Do you have a launch date for that or a platform? Can you tell us anything more about it? It's a big tease right now.
Yeah, well, I'm feeling my way through it. There is a website, just a basic website to theworldshapers.com. And yes, it just so happens that my next novel from Daw Books is called World Shaper, which and the two things tie together, oddly enough. But that wasn't the main reason I did it. I've actually thought about doing something like this a long time. I'm a journalist by training, and I've interviewed all sorts of people over the years, ranging from Weird Al Yankovic to the Oak Ridge Boys to Adam Agoyan, the film director. So I thought, well, why not take that interviewing capability I know I have and apply it to science fiction and fantasy? I'm going to be using Blueberry to host it, I think, because of their WordPress integration, because all my websites are WordPress. And they have a really nice plugin called PowerPress that makes it easy to integrate those things. And I've got 3 interviews set up so far with Tanya Huff, Julie Cherneda, and Arthur Slade, who's a young adult author here in Canada who won the Governor General's Award a few years ago. And I have tentative approval from a couple of other big names that I guess I won't say until they've confirmed an interview time. And I think with my connections in the field, I will be able to get some other really, really interesting guests. So I really hope that people will find it interesting and fascinating, and that it will take off. That would be nice.
Absolutely. I'm very interested to hear it. I think it'll be, especially with your background that you were talking about, I'm sure you're going to ask some really great questions that not all of us are going to think of, but that all of us will want to know the answers to.
My challenge is I doubt it will be weekly because I really want to read the book. My goal is to have the authors will choose not necessarily their latest book, but some book that they want to talk about so we can use it as a specific example of how they shape their worlds. And so I do need to allow myself time for some reading before I talk to some authors whose work I might not have read ahead of time. So whether it will be weekly or not, it might be 2 weeks. I hope it's not a month. I think I can do it in 2 weeks. But it'll be episodic, so it doesn't really matter. You can listen to them in any order. It's not like there'll be a particular time component to it.
That's
so we'll
exciting.
see how it goes.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to that. I know that your writings include fantasy, science fiction, as we mentioned, poetry, nonfiction, children's books, so many things. Honestly, I wondered how hard it is for you to switch gears, or if it's not hard at all.
It's just what I do.
Yeah.
I can go from working on a children's biography of Angela Merkel, which was actually my first book that came out this year, to this middle grade fantasy novel that I was writing on spec that I mentioned, that I just sent off to my agent not too long ago, to my World Shaper next book in that series, although I haven't really got started on that, but that'll be the next big thing. And I'm writing a play this spring as well. I don't have any trouble switching gears.
Yeah, that is fantastic.
I've been typing a lot my whole life, so it's just like you put me in front of a keyboard and
you just start going. How many books, or actually pieces, doesn't just have to be books, it could be a play, it could be a short story, it could be anything. Do you typically publish in a year?
I don't know that there's a typical answer. It just depends on what I get contracted to do. Mm-hmm. So I've been looking at this year. There's the Angela Merkel book, the poetry book. I had a history of the emergency mine rescue competition run by the Saskatchewan Mining Association. That was 3. Past the Stars has come out. City-Born paperback, I guess, counts. That's 5. I'm going to have this First World War memoir from my grandfather-in-law out by the end of the year, and probably a World Shaper, of course. I shouldn't forget that one. 7, and I expect I'll have maybe 2 more things from Shadow Paw Press from my back catalog. So I could be up to 9 to 10 books this year. That's more than usual, and it's because I now have my own press.
Watch out, right? That's exciting news, though, because obviously readers have a lot to look forward to from you, and writers also have a lot to look forward to from you. With the podcast as well.
I hope so.
I know that there was another article you wrote also in your Space-Time Continuum column in the magazine Freelance, and that was about, I thought it was a very interesting topic you chose, about what authors owe writers. And it sounded like something that was very much like a passionate type of thing of yours, because I think there was a playwright or someone who had said, I owe my fans, my readers, whoever, nothing. And that was something that you totally disagreed with. And I liked your answer. You said that you owe your readers a fantastic, engrossing read. So I wanted to bring that up because it is kind of almost a philosophical type of thing that I guess a lot of writers must think about.
Yeah, I can understand the art for art's sake, where you write what you write, and if nobody reads it, that's fine. And I can even appreciate that. But as a professional writer, someone who is actually trying to do this and make money at it, to be blunt, I do feel that I owe my readers that, because I'm competing for their entertainment dollar, basically. I'm competing for all the other things, their time. I'm competing for a lot of things that are precious to them. And the least I can do is think about that and give them a reward. That doesn't mean that I would write necessarily what fans want, because fans contradict each other, right? You can have a bunch of fans want one thing, a bunch of fans want another thing. You can't just write to that. But the least you can do is say that whatever I write, whether you agree with the plot or not, you at least know that you're in competent hands, and you can trust that there will be something that is worthwhile you spending your time and money on. And I think it's just part of what I see as the transaction between writer and reader. And as I've often said too, writing is really a collaborative thing. There's this image that you have in your head when you put it, but then what image the readers get when they read your words on the paper may actually be quite different from what you intended. So it is really a collaborative process in that sense. And so, yeah, if you're not reaching the reader, if you're doing something that readers absolutely abhor and nobody wants to read, then you've pretty much failed as a writer, because the whole purpose of writing is to communicate those images and ideas into other people's brains. It's a kind of weird telepathic projection thing.
Yeah, that's right. Before we wrap up here, I wanted to ask you a question that I did discuss also with Robert J. Sawyer, and I would like to ask you too, because both of you have published traditionally, you've published yourselves, you've pretty much run the spectrum on publishing. And so I wondered what you see as your own future for publishing. Will you remain doing both traditional and self-publishing and, maybe indie press, whatever works best? Do you see yourself leaning in one direction or another?
I will keep being published traditionally as long as I can find traditional publishers that want to publish me. And DAW is a wonderful publisher to work for. World Shaper will be my 9th book with them, and they've just been fantastic. And I there's no way I would ever go to DAW and say, that's it, I'm done, I'm going to indie only. There's just no way. They have distribution, they have cover art, they have things that, it's nice to just be able to write and not have to worry about that. And now that I have my own press, I see even better how much of that other stuff there is. But at the same time, I'll do whatever it takes to get my words out there. So I will continue to do some indie publishing through my own press, and hybrid publishing, maybe, except now that I have my own press, that's less likely because I can do it myself. But yeah, I'll use whatever works.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Ed.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's just find out where readers can find you after this broadcast.
You can find me at edwardwillett.com, EDWARDWILLETT. Those two T's are important, TT.com. I'm on Twitter at eWillett, EWILLETT, and on Facebook at Facebook.com/Edward.Willett. So pretty easy to find. If you Google Edward Willett, I'm the first page of results.
That's good. Great. Thank you so much for joining us on the Creative Edge Writers Showcase. This has been a copyrighted podcast owned by the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network and Creative Edge Marketing. We'll be back on August 2nd at 9 p.m. Eastern Time with psychological thriller author Kelly Charon, author of Pretty Wicked and Wicked Fallout. In the meantime, you can look up our show on Facebook for updates, and we will see you in the next episode.